really appreciate everybody being here, both my speakers and my students. I'm going to start off by letting each of my speakers introduce yourselves, and I'm going to go ahead and screen share so that everybody can see what you shared with me. And we'll start off. Pete, I'm going to hand the reins to you and let you give a little introduction to yourself. And just let me know when you're ready. Yep.
Yeah, so my name's Pete Durkop. I work for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I'm based out of the Kettle Moraine State Forest South Unit headquarters in Eagle. So where I work is, namely Waukesha and Walworth counties. I feel like I need to always give a basic civics lesson on governmental organization when trying to share with people where sort of I fit in the grander scheme of things. So DNR is a statewide agency, not a federal agency, not a local municipality. And within DNR, there are several different bureaus like forestry, parks and recreation, that sort of stuff. My bureau is the Bureau of Natural Heritage Conservation, formerly the Endangered Resources Bureau. And we're charged with preserving biodiversity across Wisconsin's landscapes and natural communities. So as a district ecologist, I help administer the State Natural Areas program within my area, and work cross-program with other DNR staff and internal and external partners to implement that goal of biodiversity preservation. So that's the quick and dirty of it.
Cool.
Yeah, I kind of forgot what slides I gave you.
No worries.
Yeah, so I can ramble on for a while. I don't know how long you want me to go for.
You know what? Maybe just cover what's in your slides real quick and
Okay.
Explain the importance of the state natural areas, and then we'll pass on to the next person.
Sure. Yeah. So state natural areas are sort of a unique designation of a piece of land. State natural areas, it's a program within the Bureau of Natural Heritage Conservation that contains some of the best examples of natural communities present in the state. It also contains unique geological features and unique natural heritage features. We as a bureau switched the name from endangered resources because we kind of did a lot more than just rare species, and that natural heritage is actually a better description of what it is that we do. Thinking about the culture of a people, it's typically tied pretty intimately with their surrounding landscape, and native landscapes, remnant communities, contain a lot more than just rare species. And state natural areas are sites that preserve those things.
Cool.
I think we have almost 700 different state natural areas. The acreage accounts for maybe 1% of the DNR's total land ownership. State natural areas don't have to just be on DNR property, Department of Natural Resource property. There's a lot of partner sites, local land trusts, nonprofit organizations, the University of Wisconsin system, county government, Waukesha County and Milwaukee County both have some properties that have state natural area designations. And so if you think about the number, like probably 90% or more of the rare species that occur within the state of Wisconsin occur on state natural areas. So it's a real testament to the quality of the sites and the weight that if a property carries an SNA designation, that's a lot of weight. Because
which might segue well into that second slide of about
Right.
opportunities.
Yeah, I threw this in. So the landscape of Wisconsin is broken up into these ecological landscapes. I'm not sure how much you may have covered this, may not have.
We
But in
did.
southeast was okay. So in southeast Wisconsin, there's two main landscapes, and these occur across geological divisions, and they occur uh, based on latitude and temp and climate. So there's several in Wisconsin. The Southeast Glacial Plains ecological landscape, the map on the left, is one of the largest in the state. The other really big ones being like the Western Coulees and Ridges, which is the core of the driftless area of Wisconsin and the southwest part of the state. And on the right side, there's the Southern Lake Michigan coastal plain. And so there's also a Central Lake Michigan and an Upper Lake Michigan coastal ecological landscape as well. But this is one of the real big broad strokes sort of things, is how as an agency we prioritize the work, and how as the Natural Areas Program prioritize our work. These conservation opportunity areas are sites that are known to have a high degree of biodiversity. There's different levels of significance. Probably can't really see it so well, but the dark green is global significance. The light green, continental. The light green is regional, upper Midwest, and the yellow is statewide significance. And so some of the factors that go, and there's also the rivers too. The rivers have different degrees of significance as well. So how these are determined is based in a lot of different factors. A big one that makes the Southern Kettles a globally significant conservation opportunity area is the presence of the globally imperiled oak savanna natural community, or oak opening. So this is and these globally significant, we say these big things that are like, oh, this is of continental significance, this is globally significant. Like, what does that mean? Well, it's like, well, there's so few places in the world that have remnant oak opening natural communities, that if you have a resource in your backyard of global significance, that carries a lot of weight to be a steward for that resource. The world is counting on you to preserve this site, because if diversity is important, this is a region of huge importance. It's pretty big magnitude.
Yeah.
On the Southern Lake Michigan coastal EL, there's not as many colors on that map, but in the far southeast corner, that would be the Chewauquee Prairie, which is a critical importance for Lake Michigan migrants. There's remnant wet and mesic prairie down there, which is extremely rare. And it's just a really, really important layover site for migratory birds that use the Lake Michigan flyway. That's one reason that is a standalone state natural down there that carries that global rating as well. So this is sort of, broad strokes, what's going on in the Southeast. And so we talk about prioritizing and the importance of the work. Well, what is the actual work that we do? So I'm the lead for a state natural areas field crew that's based out of the Southern Kettles. We also have state natural areas crews based out of Bong Recreational Area and Fitchburg, Green Bay, La Crosse, Adams Friendship, Spooner. So we're kind of sprinkled around the state, and our main focus is conducting habitat work that's gonna advance the goal of preserving biodiversity on Wisconsin's SNAs. So we light things on fire, we crush things with machines, We, spray herbicide on invasive species, and that's a day in the life. It changes with the seasons. It's a hell of a lot of fun. It can be pretty brutal, but it's a damn fine way to spend the day. And we catch flack for concerning ourselves in the ways of flowers and butterflies and snakes and things. They're not necessarily quite as charismatic as some turkey hammering in the woods and black bears and that sort of stuff. But it's a way of managing from the base. Part of Aldo Leopold's vision, and a line that he's really well known for is to keep every cog in peace is the first step in intelligent tinkering. And that's sort of a lifeboating principle, that if we know that a natural ecosystem contains all the components that we need, or that make it good and function well, then why would we discard some of these parts? If you are rebuilding an engine, you're not going to just say, over the course of taking it apart, just like leave some parts out when you put it back together. It's like everything in there has a purpose, whether we understand it or not. So that, hence the importance of biodiversity. And so when we look at things like invertebrates, which there's 25,000 or more species within the state, or reptiles and amphibians, we have over 50 species, and plants, which there's over 2,500 species. Paying attention to the little things really, and managing from the base of the pyramid, as it were, is a better foundation for land management as a whole.
That's awesome. That plays in really well to some of the things we talked about. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask you to shut off your video to save bandwidth.
Bet.
And I think, Megan, you're up next.
All right. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Megan, and I'm with the Waukesha County Land Conservancy. A lot of what Pete talked about, I'll also mention briefly, but basically what we do is we're a nonprofit land trust. So we rely on memberships, donations, federal, state grants, that kind of thing, to basically, have our mission come true. What we like to do is protect and care for environmentally significant lands and waters for future generations. So we're based in Waukesha County. The majority of our properties are in the county, although we do have one outside of it. We have currently protected over 3,000 acres. The majority of that are open to the public properties. Some are easements as well. I can touch a little bit on those too, but there is a map here that shows some of our open properties. It's kind of hard to see, but if anyone is interested in just taking a hike on any of these properties, if you live nearby, feel free to shoot me an email and I can let you know where they are. But basically, what do? We acquire land either through purchasing, it's donated to us, or through partnerships, sometimes with the DNR, with other land trusts, things like that. And then once we protect the land, it is our responsibility to care for it. So that is stewardship, which is what Peter also kind of touched on too. So because we've amassed this amount of land that we own and have easements on, it is our responsibility to make sure that we protect it for the biodiversity that was there when we purchased it or acquired it, as well as making it better habitat for the natural communities that are there and the wildlife that come along with that. So 40 of our properties are open to the public, 29 are conservation easements. This means that we don't necessarily own the land. A landowner or a subdivision may actually own the parcel, but we own the development rights. So we say you can't build buildings, you can't remove trees, you can't, in general, disturb the natural community that's there. It's protected as open space and as wildlife habitat, as well as nature areas for the neighborhood or whoever owns the property to enjoy into the future. Then we also have the 2 properties that were protected in partnership, one being with the DNR and then the other with the city of New Berlin. So we constantly try to find new partnerships and ways to protect. As a nonprofit, you know, we don't have a giant budget, so we have to figure out on a yearly basis, and even more often than that, monthly basis, whatever it is, how we're going to protect more and more parcels in the county with a limited budget. So that's where a lot of the times the DNR is at play as well, where we can get grants from them in order to protect certain properties. Some properties that we own are state natural areas, as Pete touched on as well. So those are very high quality. They're ones that we want to make sure are maintained into the future. And we do also partner just in management as well. So we have worked with Carroll University for many years now. We've worked with Todd for a few years, doing the freshman service day we have started now at our Heartland Marsh Preserve. We have students that come out and help us remove invasive species. We've also done seed collection events there. And then with other universities, we do other things where they help us write land management plans and things like that. I will call out Leonard as well. He helped with Todd do some mussel monitoring of our Scuppernong Creek that runs through one of our properties, which was a great opportunity for us to do some more wildlife monitoring, expand our wildlife monitoring program, as well as just have some fun in the river and figure out what's going on out there. So that's what we do management wise. We try to protect as many properties as we can in the county. I don't know if many of you grew up in Waukesha County, but I did. And I just over, you know, the span of my lifetime have seen Waukesha County change dramatically. We have a lot of that globally significant conservation opportunity areas in our county. A lot of it is the oak savanna or the oak woodlands, and those are ones that get they're highly developable. So, you know, a lot of them were taken down or destroyed for development, that sort of thing. So that is why the Waukesha County Land Conservancy was started, was to protect these areas and hopefully you know, keep some natural area in a county that's developing at a rapid rate, and it's continuously developing, you know, as we speak too. So I think, Todd, you can maybe go to the next slide.
Awesome. Thank you. There you go.
Okay, so I did touch on this a little bit. A lot of this is that global significance. We have one of the richest biodiversities in the state of Wisconsin, just because in Waukesha County, we're on that tension zone. So there's those 2 ecological landscapes that Pete also touched on. And then we have the globally significant natural communities that reside there as well. So again, that is why the Waukesha County Land Conservancy was started. It began in 1992, so it's 28 years old now. And over those 28 years, that is why this organization has focused so much on protecting and preserving these natural communities, because they are so significant on a global scale. But beyond that, we also like to look at wetlands. I mean, wetlands are extremely important. I'm sure Todd has touched on those too. And we just have a lot of rare plants that reside in this county and unique ecological landscapes. So again, we just try to preserve and protect for these natural communities and then for the plant and wildlife that they support. Just like Pete touched on, butterflies, bees, everything plays a huge role in what we do when we are analyzing a property for protection, either through purchase, donation, whatever it may be. We have a project selection criteria list that we go through, and we make sure that that property has some significance about it. Does it have rare plants on the property? Is it one of these natural communities that is rapidly disappearing? Does it have, like, for example, these pictures in the bottom left corner, that's a kitten tail there. That's a very significant plant that is not, you know, it's threatened, so it's not doing so well, and it's found a lot in Waukesha County. So when we find it on one of our properties, that's what we look at when we're trying to prioritize our management as well. So that's kind of us in a nutshell, and I guess I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. Liz, I think you're up next.
Okay, you guys can hear me and see me now. Okay, my name is Liz. I am a raptor educator from Schlitz Audubon Nature Center. So we are a nature center located on the north side of Milwaukee. We are in Bayside, Wisconsin. We have 185 acres on our property, a lot of different mixed lands on there. We have a short Lake Michigan shoreline. We have oak savannas as well, and a lot of different wetlands. So we see a lot of different species on our lands, and we are also on the Mississippi Migratory Flyway. So we see a lot of breeding birds that stop along our nature center and breed on our lands as well. So what our nature center mainly focuses on is land conservation and restoration, as well as citizen science and environmental education is our main goals of our nature center. You can flip to the next slide, Todd.
All right, there you go.
Thank you. So I kind of broke down our main focuses at Schlitz Audubon. So with our native restoration of our lands, so our center is divided into 256 different sections called stands. And we look at each of those, we look at the plant type in that stand, the soil consistency, and decide how can this section of land best support the ecosystem? How can this section of land best effectively support the diversity of native and migratory species? And we are stewards of land by eradicating invasive species such as buckthorn. So we have a lot of buckthorn on the property, so we tear that up and reestablish native plants. And then another thing we are dealing with, as a lot of southeastern Wisconsin is emerald ash borer. So we first discovered emerald ash borer on Schlitz Audubon property back in 2016. And at that time, about 35% of the center's canopy was ash trees. So we had to kind of identify these affected ash trees on the property, remove them, restabilize the slopes with other native species, and or convert the area into savanna. So we were doing that as well. And then a big project that just got started was our stormwater management project. So with that, we are creating wetlands on our property, which span about over an acre and can now detain about 450,000 gallons of stormwater runoff, which will help with conservation of freshwater services, as well as stabilize our North Ravine area, which is a sorry guys. I was talking to Todd before this about my cat, so yeah. So, and that's kind of the main focuses at Schlitz Audubon, and that leads into what we do with citizen science. So we're doing all these things to protect our land on our 185 acres on our property. And then to decipher if these things that we're doing are working, then we go into our citizen science, which is on the next slide.
All right.
So we are conserving the land, working on native restoration, and then to see if our conservation efforts are working, we have to look into the population data. Are we seeing these species come to our property, such as we do different bird count surveys, frog and toad surveys, mussel monitoring, so we can understand the health of the populations on our land. So are we properly conserving the land? Are we inviting in these species of greatest conservation need? And is it working, basically? And these numbers are compared year to year to see if we are bringing in different species, if these species are being supported. For example, we've seen red-headed woodpeckers on our property, which is a species of greatest conservation need, which relies on oak savanna. So we're working to create that on our property. And then our woodland loop, which is part of our property, is a reptile and amphibian conservation area. So that's we have a couple of different permanent ponds and vernal ponds, and these support species such as the blue spotted salamanders, the Blanding's turtles, and stuff like that. So staff members as well as volunteers will come in and do these surveys every year throughout the year to see if we have good populations on our lands. And then what I do at Schlitz Audubon, which is on the next slide, is I am a raptor educator. So at our Schlitz Audubon property, we have 50 different education ambassador animals. Part of that is we have 16 non-releasable birds of prey. So these are all birds that have been deemed non-releasable to the wild. So that we get them from different wildlife rehabilitation centers. This picture here is our beautiful bald eagle. Her name is Valkyrie, and she is imprinted on humans, and that's how she came to us. We do also have a peregrine falcon, some owls and such. Our newest member of Schlitz Audubon's raptor program is our red-shouldered hawk named Atlas. And so we do these education programs with these birds, and Atlas teaches about wetland conservation because red-shouldered hawks are a threatened species in Wisconsin, and they rely on wetlands for part of their habitat. And raptors work for our education programs because they are an indicator species, meaning that they represent the health of the environment. So their presence or absence or abundance tells us if the habitat in the environment is healthy. So these raptors, we bring them to our education programs, and they work as education ambassadors, and we do hundreds of education programs every single year. And we just teach people about conservation and do a lot of environmental education outreach, because part of the problem, of course, is if the general public doesn't understand we have a conservation problem, we go out there and educate them on kind of conservation and stuff like that.
Awesome. Thank you. Jill, you're up.
Welcome, everyone. First, I'd like to say I'm glad that I'm the last one, because after listening to everything that's been said so far, my talk fits in, kind of poking into all the areas to make some sense. But first, I just wanted to, I'm not sure who's listening out there, but I know you're younger than most of the speakers here. And I remember back to when I was your age so vividly, and how I was influenced to spend the rest of my living hours working towards protecting remnants and protecting beautiful open spaces. And I ended up focusing on protecting farmland because I realized Wisconsin has some of the most fertile soils in the world. So I ended up working for a land trust called Tall Pines Conservancy, which works in the same area as Waukesha County, but since most of the farmland in Waukesha County is now getting, if you've looked at some of the maps, most of the land in Waukesha County is turning into subdivisions and building sites. There is quite a bit of farmland in the western part of Waukesha County. So what we did as a land trust, since our mission statement is to preserve farmland and water quality, we also preserve open spaces, but most of the time, those open spaces are connected to some of the farms, because if you look at any farm, it's not just fertile soil, it's upland forest, oak ecosystems, and wetlands, and oftentimes connected to rivers. And then we start to concern ourselves with, well, if we're saving these farms and protecting the farms through conservation easements, as Megan had explained, where the farmer still owns the land, but the land can never be developed, we started a watershed farmer group, which is happening throughout the whole state, where farmers are encouraged to use best practices to protect the waters and to keep the soil healthy and fertile, which therein lies practices such as cover crops, which we've now started to aerial seed with helicopters to get that seed in much earlier than before. I think we're up to almost 1,000 acres of seeding cover crops right into the corn or crop. And then making sure that you're not tilling up the land anymore. Farmers are finally realizing they don't have to till their soil, that they can drive the seed into the ground, the soil structure stays in place, most of the erosion is alleviated. They can actually get rid of their large equipment that takes a lot of gas and fuel to drive that heavy soil over every spring. And it's becoming a movement now more and more. So we connect with the farmer-led group, and then we also work closely with the lake groups like McWanago River Watershed, Friends of Fox River, the Rock River Coalition, and Bark River and the Oconomowoc River. And there, I think I'd like to stop and just kind of, after you've listened to the speakers before me, and you're thinking, I'm talking to the students now, and you're thinking, where are my skills? And why am I listening to this? And why am I in environmental studies to begin with? You must have a reason that brought you to where you are right now. And then you start looking at your skills and what really intrigues you. And as you're listening to these speakers, you've listened to somebody who works for the federal government or works for DNR, and the government is driven by taxpayers, so they kind of have to follow the orders of what legislature. They have to follow the rules. So there's the DNR, there's the state legislature, there's the county, the local units of government, and then the federal government. Well, then you have the nonprofits. Nonprofits are driven through their membership, but they also have to follow IRS rules that most of their work is worthy work that's done for public good. And so we're always circling back to, is this for the public good? And that's where you get all the friends groups, the land trusts, the Mid-Kettle Partner Group. Pete showed you that map of the Mid-Kettle region with the glacial, where the two glaciers come together. That's a prime area for the critical species habitat and remnants and ecosystems, oak ecosystems, and does contain a lot of those species of greatest concern. So as land trusts, we focus on that area quite heavily. Oftentimes, when you prioritize land, you use that as one of the criteria. Is it in the Mid-Kettle? Is it near a body of water? If we're preserving farmland, if it's close to a river or a stream, we'll put that at the top of the list. And that's why I'd like to talk about my favorite topic, Mason Creek. This project alone, if any of you are students, would make a great research paper. Because, and this is, first I want to start by saying, anytime you're driving along a road and you see a stream or a ditch or a river, look at the shore, just stop and look down at the water. Try to be a citizen science monitor. You don't have to take notes. You don't have to dip something in the water. Just look at it and observe it and say, oh, wow, here's a cornfield. It just rained yesterday, and there's this river of mud going into this sweet little stream. Okay, so Mason Creek was a stream that you never noticed. If you drive on CW, you could go over it your whole lifetime and not even know it's there. And it crosses the roads. It's only 7 miles long, and it ends up in North Lake. North Lake is at the top of the chain of lakes. And as you know, we are living in lake country. Mason Creek is a Class 1 trout stream, and yet it's a EPA impaired stream, which means it's total maximum daily load. Basically, it can't take any more pollutants. It's had it. It's topped out. It can't take any more. And so part of the leg of the river, the creek, is agricultural. And there's, over the years, been a lot of ditching, and they've drained the wetlands, which has happened all over the state at the turn of the century, to try to drain these wetlands for ag land. And now, through the federal government, we're trying to convert those wetlands back, because as you know, with all these huge rain events, these farm fields are filling up with water because there's nowhere for the water to go. And then as it recedes, it's pulling in all the sediment full of phosphorus and nitrogen, and that goes into the streams and then down into the lake. And from North Lake, it follows all the way down to the Rock River and eventually into the Mississippi. And you've all read about the hypoxic Gulf of Mexico. So we started focusing on making Mason Creek as a land trust 10 years ago, wrote a grant, and that's the way most land trusts stay in business, is they try to write grants and they try to find great partners like Carroll University. At that time, Todd, did you come to some of our meetings, or I don't remember. But anyway, we received a grant through the DNR and Sewer PAC to do a river protection planning grant. And through that, we now received a DNR 50,000 grant to engineer part of this class 1 trout stream that's highly polluted, and we're going to re-meander it back to its original course. And with that, we tapped into all our area partners. That's what you do when you have a project. You go, okay, who's out there that can help us? One of our major partners is Trout Unlimited, because they're just loving to try to restore any trout stream that can have public access for their angling, for their fishing. And then we, of course, went to SewerPAC and Carroll University as experts, as some of our area experts in the Oconomowoc River Watershed Protection Program and many other partners. So this will be one of our major project areas. But as a study, it has a great history, has some endangered species in it, in addition to trout. So yeah, I guess you can go to the next slide. This information is all on our website too, if you like. The next step then, as you can see, that top left photograph, that's going right into North Lake. So every rainstorm, it creates a plume of sediment. Phosphorus enters the lake. 1 pound of phosphorus can make 450 pounds of aquatic invasive species. So if you look at the chain reaction, that aquatic invasive species then fills in the shoreline, and then you have a decrease of habitat, critical habitat. And the first main project we had was that red outlined area was to revert those ditches back into wetland, and that's what we've been all along this creek finding the hot spots with the help of the DNR and the watershed program. Now you can go to the next slide. And this Mason Creek Watershed Protection Program was the very first program that came out of SewerPAC that had to follow the EPA 9 key element requirements, which mainly the EPA is saying a watershed approach to protecting rivers and streams needs to follow this protocol. And let's see, you can Google that, but mainly for us, first you have to identify the cause and source of the pollution. Then you estimate how to reduce it, which is what the study did. And then you figure out all the technical, which we've tapped into the ecological services and the like. And then there's an education component, which I'm doing right now, so I can check this one off the list for today. And then you do a project schedule. This sounds like any other project. And then the most important part is the measurable milestones and how you measure your progress or your non-progress. And so you have a monitoring program. All along this creek, we have monitors. And I think I'll end with that. Well, can you advance the slide? I think I had one more. So let's see, is that it?
Yeah, I think that was the last slide that that I'd pulled in.
Yep, that sounds good. Well, I guess lastly, I'd just like to say there are so many wonderful nonprofits out there that do help with land protection. I want Pheasants Forever and Ducks Unlimited, as I said, Trout Unlimited, but I did want to end this with this. After listening to Pete, there is now a oak ecosystem initiative in this area, and I'm hoping all nonprofits and nature centers and everyone jumps on board with this one for sure. And some of us I know on this panel are also on the Critical Species Habitat Committee. And one thing that I just want to put out there for your students is some of these lands that maybe 10 years, 20 years ago were defined as state natural areas and critical species habitats. They've been going out to assess those areas now, and some are so degraded that they almost have to be taking them off the list. And that makes me so sad. So I guess for sure we need to preserve, and then we need to protect these lands as best we can. And that's where a lot of energy, if you think of anything, would be just think of these endangered species that are just getting crowded out by invasive species, and we can still save them. That's my last note. line of the day.
Awesome. That's a good note to end on, I think, because I think that it's really important that we consider what we can do, what's reasonable, and how we can actually make a difference. Whether you're, and I know that I've got several people in the class who are interested in doing conservation work professionally, and some people are taking this class as an ecological elective, even though they intend to go on towards in other directions, which includes healthcare, which includes other branches of biological science. So I think that it's nice to be able to think about all the different ways that we can integrate the practice of conservation, whether that's your main job focus or whether that becomes a different part of your life. As my students know, I've posted, for example, a video on zoonoses and conservation, so diseases that we share with animals. There are some amazing, interesting, and sometimes frightening tie-ins between different branches of biology. So I would like to kick the conversation back to my students and let them ask questions if they have questions, because in a lot of ways, it's been a weird semester, but at the same time, you've had a semester of conservation, and we've talked about a bunch of different ways to approach that through modeling, through some on-site survey work. We've talked about the sort of hippo list that E.O. Wilson introduced, and so I think that we can hopefully ask some questions. I'm going to ask if you can to flip on your video and your microphone when you ask a question. I will kind of moderate, and I'd like to see what sort of questions you've got out there.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a question, especially for the non-for-profit organizations. You guys use a lot of, I believe you guys use a lot of volunteers to get a lot of your work done, and I think that's a really important part of your, whole idea and strategy and getting things done. And I'm just curious how you guys get the community involved, or how do you get individuals excited about organisms that maybe are not as glamorous like mussels? How do you get people excited about learning about them and preserving them?
That's a great question, and maybe I could jump in here, Megan, with Waukesha County Land Conservancy. Basically, what we try to do is just make everything sound as fun as it actually is. So you know how much fun we had, Leonard, right?
Yeah.
So just kind of having, and explaining the importance of it too. For example, we have more wildlife monitoring programs coming up this summer. We're going to be monitoring for bumblebees as well as bats on 2 of our different properties, as long as things go well the rest of this year. So what we're trying to do is, first of all, educate people on why it's important, why tiny little bumblebees are an important thing to monitor and manage and make sure that they thrive into the future. Same with bats or butterflies or mussels, whatever it is, just explaining to them the importance of what they play in the whole ecosystem. And then beyond that, trying to make it fun. So making it a day out that's something that you wouldn't really get an option to do, on a normal day. So making it more of an event and having people, bring their kids along, bring their mom along, things like that. So I think it's a lot of just education first, and then making it fun so that they want to continue to come back and volunteer and do do different things with you. Because I believe once they kind of touch the land and they start understanding how things fit into the larger scale, then they get more interested to come back, where if they come out for a bumblebee monitoring event, they may say, well, I'd love to come pull garlic mustard next spring, or I'd love to saw down some buckthorn in this area this fall, this winter, that sort of thing.
I could jump in now and say, once you get out on the property and you find all these amazing surprises that you weren't even anticipating, if you were just saying going to monitor the bumblebee, and then all of a sudden you see this beautiful dragonfly, or you learn something about a bird you never knew. So it's all encompassing when you're out on the land. And as Land Trust, we have programs called Conservation at Home, really just trying to bring the nature to families. But on that note, the saying is, if you learn to love the land, you'll learn to care for the land. So it's just like trying to instill that enchantment in people so that they love land and they have their little go-to places. Once the work party or monitoring's over, they have this urge to want to go back and see what they did, the results, or go back and find that insect again. So it's intriguing. So the more we can do that, and I'd like to say at this point, in the last, say, 5 years, it's been a struggle with Land Trust, because the Land Trust Alliance, which is the umbrella of all the land trusts in the nation, started to say, oh, maybe you should focus more on education outreach than on preserving land, because we have to get the youth engaged, because they're our future members. But over these last few years, Megan might echo this, or I'd love to hear what she has to say, but we've been arm in arm with the local nature centers, River Edge, Audubon, and the Retzer Nature Center here, which is county driven, so that we can work together, because they do what they do well, and what we do well too is to try to preserve more land and critical species. And so I think it's a great partnership for now, and even enhanced in the future.
Yeah, that's a great point too, Jill. Is, as small nonprofits, it is pretty difficult trying to do so many things at once, with preserving the land, but also caring for it, educating, getting people involved, especially when you have such a small staff. At Waukesha County Land Conservancy, we only have 3 staff, but that includes myself, so I only have 2 other coworkers. And I know with Jill, it's very similar. So as nonprofits, we rely heavily on partnerships with each other. Jill and I work pretty closely with Tall Pines and WCLC, try to work as much as possible together. But then we also rely pretty heavily on other organizations that are really great at doing the education and outreach, so that we can kind of just show that we all have similar missions. We all want to protect and preserve what is important in the county, and then also educate on why it is, especially as nonprofits, since we do rely so heavily on donations and memberships and things like that. It's extremely important to kind of educate your local community, and hopefully even farther out than that, on why it is important to do these kinds of things.
Cool. Great answer.
Thank you.
This is Pete. I could tack on one other thing to that. And that would just be, am I sideways?
You are.
That's weird. Okay. I would tack on that maybe I agree with what everybody else said. Just kind of getting folks excited is pretty important. But the State Natural Areas Program has a pretty robust statewide volunteer program. And part of that is because although we're a state agency, we function from a monetary standpoint more similar to a nonprofit organization, in that the majority of the funding for my bureau and our habitat crews is based off of gifts and grants, federal grants and that sort of stuff. So I spend a good chunk of my time writing grant proposals and that sort of stuff. Yeah, volunteer efforts are huge, and those one reason people like volunteering is because it's just different from what they do with their day job. We have some great volunteers that work in sort of like an industrial setting that maybe isn't the most rewarding environment for them, And what they get out of volunteer days is, you know, outside time, working outside. It's physical labor, get a sweat on, do some work. It feels good for the body. It's good for the soul. And they're always learning something. Whenever you go out to a volunteer day, it's led by folks that know the land and know the landscape and know at least a few things about the critters and plants that you're going to find on the site. So it's sort of just a generic enrichment experience. But I think something that wasn't touched on, Jill kind of got to it a little bit in her spiel, was money, right? Biodiversity pays. So, by going no-till, producers are able to save money on fuel. It's more cost effective. Something that the Nature Conservancy is implementing in Walworth County is they're planting native prairie buffer strips within row crop agriculture, to promote pollinator diversity. If you look at the efficiencies of native pollinators versus a honeybee, it's multiple times over. Native pollinators are more effective and more productive pollinators than a honeybee because there's varied sizes. They target plants differently. So if you can't get people excited about a mussel, maybe you can get them excited about increasing yields or something like that. You can find a way for money's always going to be an issue. It's always going to be something that conservation organizations are chasing dollars. So anytime you can show people that biodiversity puts money in their pocket, that's huge.
And I think that in some ways what you all have talked about a little bit with funding is a really important thing to think about, because spending your time chasing money from other sources can be really challenging, and I think that as a society we need to decide what our values are and to really think about those conservation values. And I think that at both the federal level and the state level, making those funding choices is really crucial. Wisconsin's got a great legacy of really strong support for conservation, and a lot of the Midwestern states have done a lot of that. I grew up in Missouri, where we had an 1/8 of a cent sales tax that supported Department of Conservation that did a lot. And as we look at other states, in Illinois, they support the Illinois Natural History Survey, which is a different arm that does conservation work. And I think that in a lot of ways, for those of you who are thinking about a conservation career, be really mindful of the civics lesson. I really appreciate that Pete brought that up at the very beginning about how we fund things and also who does that conservation. Because it determines what our priorities are and how that work gets done. And so at the same time, I think that it's really important that people remain engaged and support our not-for-profits. They fill a very different niche, and in some ways, they do some of the work that's supported differently than our agency work. So, I'd like to open it up again for questions. See if there are other thoughts, other questions for our panel.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Evan.
We can hear you.
Okay, so my question was just like regarding conservation in general, like how do you guys determine like what to preserve? Because like I know that everyone focuses on like the critically endangered and like the threatened species, but what about the species that are like well off to say? And like how do you guys monitor them to make sure that they're not decreasing because you're working like you're so focused on like the critically threatened as well as like just like maintaining the balance of the ecosystem, I guess is my question.
That's a great question, and I could jump in here again. So what we do at Waukesha County Land Conservancy is we still try to monitor for those common species as well, because you want common species to stay common because they do play a role in the ecosystem, like I mentioned too. So even just this past spring, every spring we partner with Waukesha County Parks and we do wetland monitoring on a couple of our properties. So we have volunteers that go out and set wetland traps, and what they do is they just keep data sets of each species they find. So we've been doing the same 4 or 5 properties the last 4 years. So what we plan to do with all of that data is to analyze it and see, okay, even if there are some rare species found, that's great. How do we keep them there and make sure that the habitat is suitable for them? But also with the common species, are they suddenly declining over the last 4 years, and what factors were at play? So that is a great question, and it is something that we're constantly trying to look at, especially as we expand our wildlife monitoring program and our citizen science opportunities to continue that. And then just for figuring out what to preserve and that sort of thing, the first part of your question, we have a project selection criteria, so it does have to fit into what our mission is, because we do want to protect the most environmentally significant pieces of land. That being said, there are a lot of different factors that go into that. So if it has wetlands on the property or ephemeral ponds, it gets a high score. If it does have the critical species habitat, it gets a higher score. That being said, a lot of common species also reside in critical species habitat, that sort of thing. So we do try to kind of keep that in our minds as well as we do preservation as well as monitoring.
At this point, I'd like to tell a story. I was first a land steward for a remnant prairie called Fayetteville Grove, which Aldo Leopold used as his stomping grounds and as an outdoor laboratory for his graduate students. That was my first enchantment, but actually, to tell you the truth, I grew up in Watertown, and this remnant prairie is outside of Lake Mills, and it was actually on a dead-end road where we used it as our drinking road. I mean, where you'd go as kids and hang out. And then all of a sudden, I find out later that here's the prairie that Aldo Leopold used and lived on the farm just down the road and did his research. And his main goal, as this land was surrounded by wetland and farmland, is how do we have a harmonious relationship between wildlife, which he loved, he was a big hunter, wildlife, and agricultural as he saw it coming into the state. And he did everything to preserve this prairie right at the same time that the Audubon, the Arboretum in Madison was creating a prairie. He did finally find someone to purchase that prairie, and now it's one of Nature Conservancy's little gold standards, although now Audubon owns it. But the story is there was a prairie right-fringed orchid there. And that is one of the endangered species and still is, as Pete would tell you. But also what we needed to do is have enough buffer for the pollinator. So, one species just doesn't stand on its own. And so this one specific moth pollinated the orchid. So our main goal was to work on habitat just for that pollinator. And consequently, you protect the land for even the normal species. But a lot of times we're looking for the keystone species, the canary in the coal mine type thing. So happily, that orchid is still there. And so that's it. Oh, I urge anyone to check that out just outside of Lake Mills. Just Google Fayetteville Grove Audubon Society.
And I can add in from a different perspective as well. At Schlitz Audubon, a relatively smaller acreage compared to Waukesha County Land Conservancy and other land conservancies, how we're looking at species on our 185 acres is what I was talking about earlier when we are separating our land into sections. And then we do our point count surveys based on different sections that we have, and looking at what kind of bird species do we have. Do we have a lot of red-winged blackbirds? We're going to, and a lot of cardinals, and looking at those species that are more abundant, but then we're also looking at the species of greatest conservation need and that they're not existing in a vacuum, they're all existing together, and how are each of those stands effectively supporting all species.
Thank you.
And I just realized that I was muted. Is Pete back on?
Yeah, I made it. I made it
Cool.
back. I don't know what.
Yeah, I saw that I was admitting, and it just kept rolling for a minute. I don't know how much of that you heard. Would you mind chiming in a little bit about how we set which species are a priority, and maybe also how we select which species are endangered at the state level? And I think that it's important too that we recognize that there are different levels of endangered. There are international organizations that identify species that are imperiled, and that's a very different recognition than federal recognition, than state recognition of endangered. So maybe if you wouldn't mind spending just a couple of moments talking about the state level of that would be great.
Right. So there's state threatened and endangered species. There's federally listed threatened and endangered species. So the state level stuff, those designations are made by Department of Natural Resources. The federal level, the national level, those designations are made by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service within the Department of Interior. And one of the global organizations that Todd was mentioning was probably the IUCN Red List, I think is the acronym, the International Union Concerned something like that. The Red List, and so that's looking at a global scale. So that's like white rhino stuff, some of those sort of species that there's like 30 on the planet. At a statewide level, so we can have species that are state endangered, but that have no national or federal listing status. And that's just because they are rare in our state. They're only located at a handful of sites. Their species population levels are low. And conversely, we can have federally listed species that seem relatively common in areas of our state. So a recent example is the Kirtland's warbler. Was a species federally listed threatened species that was recently delisted. So at a national level, Kirtland's warblers are not on the brink of we're not at the brink of losing that species. Now at the state level, we don't have a great population of Kirtland's warblers. So they are still a state listed species. So they're afforded state level protections. So if a species has this state listed designation, that's going to impact what sort of activities can occur in suitable habitat or where that species may exist. Thankfully, Kirtland's is a great example of an early successional species that benefits from like commercial timber harvest and that sort of thing. So that makes it a little bit easier to manage. But it's intensive management, and if it's not commercially viable, then someone has to pay for the work to get done. So that's like things. That's how things are designated when they're already rare. So what we try to do is one big part of my job is implementing the WAP, the Wisconsin Wildlife Action Plan. And the Wisconsin Wildlife Action Plan identifies species of greatest conservation need. These are SGCNs. I love acronyms. So these SGCNs, these are species that are close to getting a listed status. Right. So we know that once a species goes into like the threatened or endangered category, it's a whole bunch of work to bring them back. So by identifying these species before they get to that point and managing for them before they get to that threatened and endangered status, we're saving resources, we're saving time, we're saving effort, we're saving the populations, before they get to that critical juncture, because it's so much work to bring them back. Good example is like whooping cranes. Bringing them back has been just an incredibly intense effort. Captive rearing programs, guided flights, across a migratory route. Those things are just like incredibly expensive. So by being proactive, by identifying these species that are of greatest conservation need that we've identified as being at risk for listing, we can prevent that from happening.
On that note, a nice example here on restoration and protection. There's the Power Chic skipperling, for instance, that has a couple sites, I think, Pete, in Wisconsin, right? And I think they're saying there's fewer than 200 left remaining in the world. The tiny pocket in Canada, I think, some in Michigan. But in any case, we have these prairies that we need to burn so we can preserve the prairie species and keep the shrubs out. And yet the fire might threaten the skipperling. So sometimes the ecologists butt heads on what to do on these critical areas, and it's almost a catch-22. You got to keep the habitat, but you may only have a few remaining skipperlings. That's why monitoring is so important, because we can maybe hone down those areas where they actually hang out the most, and maybe that's the area you won't burn, or you burn in stages. But knowledge is the most important thing, so that you're not blindly going in and just burning a whole prairie, and then you just knocked out the only population left in Wisconsin. So sometimes it really is. And speaking of whooping cranes, my whole adult life, it's been like this unicorn that you'll never see. And just this year, we stopped at Horicon Marsh, took the boardwalk. There they were. I think 3 of them just feeding in the marsh. And it was like a vision. It was like you never thought you'd see it. And when I grew up in the 70s, sandhill cranes were so rare. They had the sandhill crane calls, and everyone was assigned a wetland. They still do that with the Wisconsin, I think, is that Wisconsin Wetlands Association, whoever sponsors it. And now they're everywhere. They're talking of a hunting season. So it's observation and keeping track of their habitat and knowing what's out there.
And I might add that I'm working with some mussels that are at the edge of their range. For example, we're working with Velosa iris, which is a state endangered species, but it doesn't have federal protection. And as I'm working with the DNR to try to get funding for that, one of the things that we're considering talking about in that grant proposal is essentially that populations at the edges of their ranges are sometimes really important for their adaptive potential. So they might have genes that you don't find in other parts of the range. They might also be the populations from which you're most likely to get new new colonizing individuals that are going to be able to adapt to changing climatic conditions. So that's an important thing to think about as well. So the mussel that I'm talking about is common name is the rainbow mussel. Sorry, sometimes I trip on the common names, but it's doing all right in some parts of its range, but it needs some help at the edges, and Wisconsin is one of those edges where it's become pretty rare. And so it's got state protections, but it doesn't have federal protections because the species isn't at risk of being lost, but it is in danger of being lost from our state. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the torch back and see if we've got other questions out there. Great questions. Thank you all.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
So we mentioned the reintroduction of species quite a bit, and I was wondering, what is the biggest hurdle that conservationists have to overcome in order to successfully reintroduce that particular species?
Good question. I'm going to ask one of our.
Yeah, it's every question is answered with the preface, "It depends."
I'm laughing because one of my students actually gave me a cup that said that after I said that many times.
Yeah, but it depends. It's true. It's true. What species is it? Is it if it's a butterfly, captive rearing efforts don't necessarily take a whole lot of space to be implemented. If you're going the captive rearing route, something like like the whooping cranes or something like that, that's something that has has an annual migration. And so how are you going to facilitate that? So along that route, it was extremely expensive because there were no mothers for these eggs. So they were hand fed, guided along their route. So it was very resource intensive. Is there suitable habitat for a reintroduction to take place? So maybe an example of that would be in southeast Wisconsin is prairie chickens. So prairie chickens existed out in the Scuppernong habitat area in the Cattle South unit. I think the last known pair was shot in the 1920s or something like that. And is it realistic to think that, well, could we reintroduce prairie chickens in Scuppernong? And the answer is probably not. There's the surrounding landscape has changed so much. There's not enough suitable habitat on protected lands for them to exist there. The adjoining private lands, thanks to fire suppression, putting fires out, invasive species, and expanded altering of hydrologic regimes, ditching and tiling fields. There's not that short grass prairie type native community cover that would support them. So you kind of have to do an analysis of all these little things and put it together and sort of make an assessment. So I guess I'm glad I had a southeast Wisconsin example that was relevant. That's good.
So I think there are maybe a couple of other things that I'd like to add to that, and one of those is, it can be really difficult to bring in wild species and get them to do their thing in captivity. So whether that's just eating and surviving, or whether that's mating so that you can get a good population to then return to the wild, is sometimes really, really challenging. And I wish that I'd gotten a zoo or hatchery professional to be able to jump in on this too, because I think some of those are big issues. And one of the reasons why it'd be really nice to have them here is because, Carol has the connection to animal behavior, and that's a really important key when we're trying to find ways to reintroduce species. Reintroductions can be incredibly challenging, and especially that movement between captive and wild populations can be really tough to manage. And there are all sorts of issues with that. In my world with freshwater mussels, things like copper pipes can mess things up, because that can be toxic. And so getting a good captive rearing facility can be challenging. And then, like Pete was saying, with some of the large birds, and in particular the cranes, it can be really difficult to get them to exhibit their natural behaviors. Actually, Liz, would you mind, if you don't mind me calling you out, would you say a couple of words? I know that you mentioned imprinting and your unreleasable birds, but I think that kind of plays in here.
Yeah, so the 16 birds we have at Schlitz Audubon Nature Center, they're all birds that can be found in Wisconsin, and they're all birds that are either injured, orphaned, or they have some kind of permanent situation where they can no longer be released to the wild. So imprinting, like I touched on earlier, so Valkyrie is an imprinted bald eagle. So she was found outside the nest at a young age, and fishermen were feeding her fish, and she basically don't know exactly what happened in her life to where she was no longer with her parent eagles, but they weren't there to teach her how to be a bald eagle, so she ended up getting fed by these fishermen and everything. And then when the fishermen left for the season, then she went to people at the park and said, "Hey, do you have food?" And that, as you can understand, to be very dangerous. And then I touched on Atlas. She's our red-shouldered hawk. So she was hit by a car out in the wild, and she has a permanent injury to her wing where she has a wing droop. So while we don't work on release of species, since all of these birds have some kind of injury where they're with us for their entire life, like Ty was talking about, when we are reintroducing species, I did work in wildlife rehab for a little while, so I can kind of touch on when you're releasing rehabilitated species. I know as working at wildlife rehab, we look at where the species was found, and then we look, can we release it back into that location, or can we find a better location for that species? So you're looking at kind of the prey that's there, what they can eat and everything, and can they make it out there? So while Schlitz Audubon, all of ours are education ambassadors for life, and they have found their forever home, definitely when you're looking at releasing species, you have to look into the environment and everything.
Yeah. Thank you. Definitely appreciate that perspective, and I think that that's really important. And there are also lots of other concerns too, and I think that with the large mammals that are reintroduced, those certainly bring up a whole different set of concerns and sometimes conflicts. All you have to do is look at the wolves, for example, and watch that set of concerns.
Could I chime in on this, on the large mammal issue?
Yeah, please do, Joe.
Okay, another endangered species is our farmers, are our farmers. And you know, when you talk about resilience and diversity, the dairy farms we have are pretty undiversified. Corn, soybeans, dairy, grain crops, and beef. And what's happened, as you've read in the news locally, and even with this COVID-19, you notice when you hear in the news, when people aren't diversified, if they don't resilient, if they don't have something to fall back on, they're in rough shape. And so we're trying very hard to work with Discovery Farms at UW-Madison and the Savannah Institute that's trying to research perennial crops and diversified crops that are much more cohesive with the, say, the global warming issue, climate change issue, and working with perennial crops so you don't even have to till the soil, saving energy, as you said. And as Wendell Berry said, eating is an agricultural act. So the more we can buy locally, local eggs, local food in our area, that's one big way we can support our farmers. So just bringing that up.
And something I don't know if we've exactly stated or anything, but I know we were talking about local issues in conservation biology. And I think one of the biggest local issues, of course, being in Waukesha, Milwaukee County, is the urban sprawl and the habitat fragmentation. So when we're talking about releasing species and reintroducing species, we have to put into consideration the habitat fragmentation. If we're releasing a great horned owl on this property, can this property support multiple owls or just one? And do we know what birds or what prey is on this land? And can it support multiple of that species?
And that's a really good point. I'm really sorry, actually, that I haven't gotten a chance to either talk about that more in person with my class or to record a lecture on things like reserve design. We talked a little bit about fragmentation in the first half of the class. And we talked about, also that fragmentation doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So you break apart these pieces of habitat, and those pieces, you can't just look at those pieces and say they all add up to the same thing as we would have had before, because there's degradation in some of that fragmentation too, in the sense that you get things like edge effects, which means that the edges of those habitats are fundamentally different for the species that use them. And so you get different species that are there, you get a different community. If you're talking about an animal, then that animal's experiencing a different plant community in a lot of cases on the edge than it would be in what we would consider core habitat that's surrounded by other habitat that's similar. So if you walk along and you see the edge of a forest, that's oftentimes different than the interior of that habitat. And the other issue for reintroductions is that those habitats are fragmented, and how are organisms going to move from place to place? And before the class fundamentally changed, I think we got a chance to see some of the efforts to establish corridors, whether that was the Christmas Island crab bridges or the Colorado wildlife over and underpasses. I think that those are really important because you're able to stitch together populations in a little bit more unified way, so that those populations are able to exchange individuals. And that's really important for maintaining a high genetic effective population. So when you've got a small population, you run into all sorts of genetic issues, like inbreeding and like genetic drift. And maintaining a large number of individuals that are interacting and maintaining that population can be really important for holding on to genetic variability. And that's a big deal when we're reintroducing species. The Florida panther is a good example, because that was a small population that was losing genetic variability, that had some that had some negative effects of inbreeding going on, and people transported. And this was an official conservation program. It's not like somebody went off on their own and did this. And I think that that's really important because you can make some big mistakes in conservation by acting individually. But as part of a conservation program, panthers were moved from other parts of the country, were able to interbreed and introduce new genetics to that population that helped overcome some of the effects of inbreeding. So I think that that's a really important issue that we worry about in freshwater mussel conservation. One of the things that we worry about is that there's a really large number of offspring that an individual can have. And normally most of those offspring die. But you bring in 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 individuals into a hatchery facility, and you can create a population bottleneck. And you can then release lots and lots of individuals from an unnaturally small number of parents. So you can actually create some of those problems while you're doing an inbreeding, or while you're doing a captive rearing and release program. So that's a really important thing to think about as we're thinking about how to do reintroductions as well. Other questions? And in my graduate school training, one of the things that our chair said is always wait an uncomfortably long time to make sure that people have questions, because it feels way longer to you than to everybody else. Go ahead and jump in. I mean, if we end up talking over each other, that's okay. We'll figure it out. Other questions? So I've got one that I'm a little bit curious about, because I haven't gotten a chance to talk at all with our guests, is how are your organizations reacting to concerns about climate? How are you planning for predicted changes in climate? What sorts of data are you using, or is that just more than you can work with, more than you can plan for?
This is Pete. I got something.
Awesome.
So currently the State Natural Areas Program is kind of revamping our statewide plan and approach to which sites we manage more intensively than others. The Nature Conservancy has developed an excellent prioritization tool called Resilient Lands. So there's certain things that when we look at conservation that attract us to certain sites. One of which is size. Big sites are more resilient over time, because if you look at environmental factors, anthropogenic factors, if you have a small site, like a maple beech forest that's 2 acres in size and has these wonderful spring ephemerals, and you dump all your effort and resources into that 2-acre site. Not to say that it's not important, but if you get a windstorm and it blows the whole stand over, your ephemerals aren't really going to be able to persist there as they once did. It's not going to function really. Now, if that stand was tens of acres, now we're talking. This has some long-term viability. It can withstand a blowdown in this corner and still maintain populations for all these other species throughout the site. So size is a big part. Specifically looking at climate change, resilient landscapes are those that are large and that are topographically diverse. So if you think about species, if you think of it just like a cone, right? And something that's south facing is generally going to be warmer and have a different plant assemblage than something that would be on the north side of that cone or mountain or hill or whatever. So given that we don't know exactly what the climate is going to do, we just know that it's changing. By having a topographically diverse landscape, it should, in theory, allow for species to move up and down temperature gradients and around those topographical slopes in an effort to, allow more niches for it to persist over time. And then also getting to what a few folks had mentioned about environmental corridors. Not only topographically diverse, but diverse latitudinally, north to south, allowing species to move on their own over time through connected landscapes. So resilient and connected landscapes is this method that's been sort of spearheaded by the Nature Conservancy that we, as in the State Natural Areas Program, have sort of adopted as part of our framework to management.
Cool.
I can jump in here too, Todd, just from a land trust perspective as well. It is something that we are constantly talking about and trying to find ways to kind of put that into our mission and what we do. A lot of what we do currently is just try to, like Pete touched on, our larger properties or our properties that are all connected together, especially if we have properties that are next door to DNR properties. For example, we have a wetland mitigation project going on along the Mugwanago River in Mugwanago, and our property abuts the DNR Rainbow Springs property. So while we're doing our restoration there, we're converting an old ag field into a high-functioning wetland. We found that there were some invasive species, some other issues on the DNR side. So we're talking with the DNR about how we can look at a larger scale of restoration by either assessing their property for wetland mitigation as well, or wetland restoration, or just in the short term, finding ways to joint efforts to do invasive species removal or things like that as well. So I think right now, especially for land trust, it's difficult to assess what we really should be doing for climate change. But like Pete said, it's really a lot of figuring out, how species are going to move over time, because there is a lot of, what we think might happen. So we're trying to just plan for the future, and a lot of that also comes into our monitoring efforts. So we are going to expand our wildlife monitoring program, but we do want to expand our plant monitoring program as well, and not just for rare plants, but also for plants that are common but may all of a sudden seem like they're becoming more locally rare. So just finding out how plants are moving, how animals are moving, how our climate's really going to change, and then just focusing on the larger scale projects that we have, the communities that are already diminishing, so like the oak woodlands, oak savannas, things like that, focusing on those communities that do have more of a diversity, either topographically or whatever it may be, so that they are preserved into the future. But it is kind of a daunting task, but it's something that we're looking at all the time and trying to figure out how to, keep mitigating climate change and just predict what's going to happen.
There's a great organization called Wiki, WICCI. And that's a Wisconsin-based organization, dedicated to doing climate change assessments. There's climate change CVA's climate vulnerability assessments for basically each natural community that exists within Wisconsin. And that looks at different scenario planning. Is it going to be warmer and wetter? Is it going to be cooler and wetter? Is it going to be warmer and drier? Looking at these different potential scenarios for a changing climate to diverge, and how are different natural communities going to be able to withstand that? An oak woodland versus an oak opening, or a sedge meadow versus a wet prairie. These have different stabilities, basically, under different climate trajectories. So that's something that we'll consider. Maybe this particular natural community is more vulnerable under a changing climate. So maybe focus on, land protection efforts that surround that parcel. But it's worth stating that, I don't know, when I was going to school, it was just like climate change is this thing that's, way off on the horizon, and we got all this time to deal with it. But we don't really have a ton of time to deal with it. In the Southern Kettles Conservation Opportunity Area, it's the globally imperiled oak opening. Like, we are at risk of losing those communities. We may not have oak on our landscape the way we do now in 40 years, right? Because we're losing all of our mature overstory oak trees. Oak regeneration is being suppressed by invasive species and canopy closure and the absence of fire on the landscape. So it's getting to where people are talking about, it's important that common species stay common. I can't imagine what the loss of oak on a landscape would do, the ecological ripples that would resonate through our game and non-game species. It'd be just an incredible loss.
That's a really good point. I especially appreciate that idea of keeping the common species common. So there are dominant species, and I think that this is something that I would have loved to talk more about in class, but species can influence their communities by being common, right? So by being the ones that are the most that make up most of a community. We also have talked a little bit about some of those sort of banner phenomena, like keystone species, right? That have a disproportionate effect on their communities. Whether that's keystone predation in the classic sense, where you've got a predator that keeps other groups in check and keeps a community structure, or whether that's a little bit different, like an ecosystem engineer, organisms that are going to alter that community in ways that build a different physical environment that then really dominates the way that organisms interact and alters the physical environment for other organisms. And I know we got to talk a little bit about that in terms of forest structure and the way that forest structure is going to alter the physical environment for other organisms. So I think that's a really good point, that there are some important species, and sometimes we know what those species are. Like, they're the common species. They're the most prevalent species in an area. And sometimes that may not be readily apparent, like in the cases of keystone species, et cetera. So I want to. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I'll wait till you're done. This is Jill.
No, I was about to ask for other questions. So.
Oh, I'll just quickly say on the climate change, global warming issue, land trusts have had to tiptoe around this subject because we're membership driven. Once 350.org, McGibbons came to give a talk at the Economwalk Center, and we had our Tall Pines table there. Somebody took a Facebook page with Bill in the picture, and we almost lost one of our major funders because they didn't believe in global warming. So then land trusts were saying, don't use those terms, use climate change. And we finally, in the last couple of years, Ozaukee, Washington County decided to put the words in their newsletter and wait for the response. And he had no negative response except for one person who was just railing on the land trust, never going to be a member again. And he found out the guy wasn't even a member. So, so I think we're getting much stronger, but this generation that's listening to us now, the next 20 years are critical. And, you know, there are people that believe the earth is flat, but we have to just step over those people. I mean, not literally, step around and keep moving ahead on this issue, you know, full force with verve and vigor, because it defines everything we're doing and has an effect on everything. But I also wanted to say, with the desert lawns that we have all over, is something as landowners can do on their own is still continue to keep their hedgerows, and farmers. We're trying to encourage farmers to put their hedgerows back. When you talk about fragmentation with the checkerboard woodlots we have, the more we can encourage these wider hedgerows in the wetlands. And then lastly, I wanted to add to the resilient tool that we have now with Nature Conservancy. They also have a great tool called Wetlands by Design, which taps in all those same global climate change and fragmentation and et cetera.
Very cool. Thank you. So let me ask one more time. Other questions? I would love to have our speakers have the opportunity to respond to things that maybe you've been wondering about, or, you know, maybe we talked about in class and you didn't see how that fits into the practice of conservation, or maybe it's something practical.
Hello again. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a quick question just regarding like what's going on now with COVID-19 and everything. Like, sorry, like what impact are you guys like expecting from this, especially like nonprofits that focus on like gathering data from like the public and helping like collect that data? Like, do you guys think that there will be like a gap in that data, or like are you guys anticipating like, I don't know, just in general, like what does everyone anticipate? Like, because like you see on the news saying like in Italy, like the river is now more clear and stuff. Like obviously there's been like a positive impact on the environment because everyone's staying at home. But like, do you guys anticipate it continuing to get better? Or do you guys feel like it's going to backtrack, or like just thoughts from like a conservation aspect?
That is a great question, and I can pitch in here from our end. It's something that we're assessing, you know, as often as possible. So to answer some of your questions, with our wetland monitoring program, we were able to actually continue it this spring because the volunteers we have going out are either going out by themselves or they're going out with people that they live with, like their significant other, their kids, that sort of thing. So we were able to continue to collect that data, but it has hugely affected our entire workday and events for the spring. So usually we'd be starting our mustard pulling. We're in a garlic mustard pull-a-thon again this year, which is like a huge competition between, you know, like-minded organizations to pull the most garlic mustard. And what we've decided to do, especially because the Safer at Home was extended and because we don't know how things are going to be, even once it is lifted, to have people, again, go out. We give them maps. We provide them the education. We create more training materials, so training videos to identify species and how to pull things, how to get rid of things, so that we can still have people go out, members of the public go out and continue these programs, but by doing it more on an individual or household basis. So that's what we decided to do this year for our garlic mustard pulling. Is we have people signing up by shift. So they're going out for an hour or two at a time with their family members or whatever the case may be. We give them a map of where they should go. They get the training video that shows you, how to get rid of the species, that sort of thing. And then they report back to us, I pulled X amount of bags of garlic mustard from this location on this property at this time. And then we made it kind of a competition within our own organization where, well, now this family pulled 10 bags. Well, the other family pulled 15. And by the end of May or the beginning of June, depending on when the Safer at Home is lifted, we'll then be awarding some kind of an award to the family or the individual that pulled the most amount of garlic mustard bags in the spring. But again, it is something that's kind of, we don't have all of the answers. We're still looking at this summer when we have the bumblebee monitoring, our bat monitoring, all these other programs. Is there going to be more restrictions on that? Are we going to be able to, actually train people in person? Are we going to have to do more training videos? Are we going to have to postpone things, even events getting to October, that sort of thing? We're trying to analyze it on a day-to-day basis, and we're staying hopeful that things are going to get better and that we'll be able to kind of have people come together again through our events and work days and things. But we may have to continually kind of change things so that people can do it either on their own or in their households, that sort of thing. As far as memberships and donations go, that's been something we've been analyzing very closely too, just because a lot of people aren't working right now. So finding ways just to keep the public engaged through social media, through videos, through e-news, keep people excited about spring, about the spring ephemerals that are going to be start blooming or already are blooming this year, just to keep people engaged and excited about nature. So.
I could add in with Schlitz Audubon, that's one of our main focuses too, is just continuing on with our online education programs and everything. So we do a lot of stuff on our Facebook page and share our Nature from Home stuff. And in regards to what we're doing at the center, we still have some 2020 projects that are ongoing that can be grant funded and can be done individually. So our wetland monitoring is still going on. Our naturalist test is still coming on to the site and able to do stuff individually. It will be interesting to see the 2020 numbers from what we're doing, like their point count surveys. Like right now is a good time to see migratory species and everything, as well as breeding species. And we won't have those numbers because we aren't able to do our point count surveys. We aren't able to have our volunteers come onto the property. So it will be interesting to see after all this how our numbers are affected from our wildlife monitoring in that perspective. But yeah, just to kind of keep the community involved, we're doing a lot of online programming and stuff on the environmental education aspect of our nature center.
And I would just like to, on that, with engaging the public, Megan mentioned some of these events are going out to October. And Waukesha Land Conservancy and Tall Pines is helping out with the second annual Oktoberfest to celebrate and educate the public on oak ecosystem, the value of oak ecosystems. So that'll be going on October 3rd, and we're just hoping that can be open to the public and the social distancing is not in place. But if not, we'll get creative, I guess, right, Megan?
As far as the DNR is concerned, and from like a habitat manager perspective, this has been pretty devastating. We've basically missed our entire spring prescribed fire season. We had 3,000 to 6,000 acres we were planning on burning this spring. And in this landscape, fire is our most critical management tool for getting work done. Everything else that we do, whether it's heavy equipment, forestry mowing, herbicide treatments, plantings, herbaceous weed control, all of that has prescribed fire at the hub of the wheel of our management strategy. So to have that kind of thread of the sweater pulled out has really kind of set us back, and when you're looking at an integrated management approach where you're piecing all these different management methods together, you know, you kind of time these things. You time these things. So, you know, we've done these 2 years of forestry mowing here. We're going to follow up with fire and then do herbicide treatment. It's not quite as simple as you know, oh, we'll just make it up next year. It doesn't work like that. You only get so many burn days per year. And fire is the most cost-effective management tool that exists on the landscape. There's no way you're going to touch 1,000 acres of you know, wet prairie, wetland complex with, you know, a tractor to mow it or some other piece of equipment, or you're not going to do it by hand. Like, fire is the only way that you can really manage that. So missing out, having the statewide burn ban has been just very difficult from a management perspective, and it has kind of shaken our whole approach for the next year. So we're going to have to adapt, you know, figure out how we're going to change what our plan was for the next year. So yeah, it's hard. And I had to lay off some of my crew for a few weeks. You know, our interns that were coming on for summer help, you know, their start date is going to be delayed. So it's just a big ripple effect that we'll feel for a while.
All right. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Not particularly surprising in a lot of ways. But that's, yeah, it's an amazing impact that we're all sorting through. I want to make sure that students have had a chance to ask questions. If you have an additional question, please speak up. Unmute yourself so I can see that you want to talk. All right. Well, I do want to be cognizant of everyone's time. We're coming up on almost 2 hours, and I know that that's a solid chunk of time, and I'm really grateful to our speakers who've gotten a chance to join us this morning. Pete, Liz, Megan, Jill, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. I think my students really appreciate it too. It's really nice to be able to have your perspective as people who are out there, and doing some of these things and implementing things that we've had a chance to talk about. Any last words? Parting thoughts?
Just thank you for having us. And if anyone is interested in getting involved, even if it's an individual garlic mustard pulling day, follow us on Facebook or shoot me an email. I'm always available. So thanks again, Todd. It was great being a part of this.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd, for putting this together throughout this whole 2 hours. I have been telling myself this has been the most productive meeting I've had since we've been in lockup. And most of them, I keep saying I am zoomed out, but
Yeah.
this one, Todd, I can't thank you enough. You brought students together and you gave us a purpose and able to express our work and ourselves. And thank you so much for putting this together. I would consider this highly successful and we should do more.
For sure. Thank you. Well, it's been great sharing.
I would love to hear what the students thought of it too. It'd be fun to get feedback.
Anybody want to speak to that? Or if not, I can collect responses, share that with Jill, or you're welcome. Any of my speakers mind if I put your email address on our course webpage?
That is fine.
Fine.
Feel free.
Cool. Well, once again, thank you everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. I think this is a nice way to end the class so that we can sort of think about how these things are functioning out there in the real world. And, I appreciate being able to talk to people who are close and are doing the things that we can see. Yeah, I wish we could have seen more this spring. Would have loved to see you all in person and to get out to some of the locations where you're doing work. But this really has been great, and I think that you brought some really awesome perspective, and I especially appreciate the diversity of perspectives that we got to see this morning. That's fantastic. Everybody's working on the same general goal, and yet have different approaches, different constraints, and different ways of dealing with it. So I think that's a really cool thing for me to see. Even now, I've been doing this for a while and have been working with different groups for years now, but it's still really cool to see and hear how everybody's pieces fit together in sort of this landscape of conservation. So thank you very much. With that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. And for students, I will try to get this posted to our Canvas site as soon as I can. Partners, if you want a copy of this recording or any other information, like Jill was asking for, thoughts from students, I'd be more than happy to provide that. So have a wonderful day, everybody. Hang in there, and if I can help, let me know. Thanks again.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Todd.
Dad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Okay.